we will talk about this particular course on training of trainers. This course is designed specially for those who are in the profession of training, either for the industry or for the academia. All of us know that is in the era of technology, it becomes very important that we develop human capital for the organization, for the institute and for the nation, and vis-a-vis we can say about that is for at the global level. So, this particular course has been designed how we can conduct the training programs, that is training techniques and tools which are to be used for the MDPs and FDPs. Similarly, before this particular phase, we will talk about identifying the training needs, that is what are the training needs and how to identify the training needs in an organization, and introduction of the training. First I will discuss today in this particular session, which will talk about that is the what is the training, its needs, its importance, and how we can enhance our manpower, skills, knowledge, attitude, ability, so that we can develop the human capital. Now, here first I would like to share with you the formula of success. Whenever we talk about the success, success is equal to A into M into O. What is A, what is M and what is O? A is for ability. Whenever we want to make a successful training programs, first we have to identify those who are the trainees, what type of ability they require. To understand the ability, one should interact with the participants and to know about the JD, that is job description. What is the job description? Job description will give us there is what type of ability an individual and employee has to develop. Normally, if we refer this particular ability, first one is that is the job ability or what is called is technical skills. Technical skills means it is not related to the technology only, it is related to the job, that one should have that particular skill of the what type of the job he has to do. Second is those who are expert in their jobs, but they are not successful. Why they are not successful? Because they are not having the another very important skill, that is HR skills. You will find there are the number of leaders, those who are very strong in their the job knowledge, they are very competent, but they are not successful because they are not able to get work done from the people those who are working with them. And for this purpose, a team building skills, leadership skills, motivational skills, conflict handling skills, all these skills, stress management skills, emotional intelligence, spirituality, all these skills, these are all are the HR skills, interpersonal skills. If the person is very strong in the HR skill also, in addition to the job knowledge. So, we can understand that is the job knowledge cannot be replaced, but that is only job knowledge is not enough, that has to be supported by the HR skills. Further research has been done and it has been found that is in addition to the job knowledge, HR skills, there is a third skill and that is the conceptual skills. Conceptual skills means whatever the job person is doing, he should be very clear that what he is contributing and where this job will be connected with the another job in the organization, and ultimately what type of the product or services are to be developed. Once the conceptual skills are strong, HR skills are strong, and then job analytical skill, job description skills, job knowledge is there, then definitely that person we will say that he is an able person and he has developed that particular ability. To develop this ability, there is a role of a trainer. Trainer has to develop this particular type of the abilities. He has to understand whether it is required the job skills, whether it is required the HR skills, whether it is required the conceptual skills, analytical skills are there. Lot of work has been done. Further, in this one more nowadays, and one more skill has been added, and that is designing skill or creativity or creative skills. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is the person is creative. We understand that whatever theoretical knowledge will be imparted, that will not be enough unless and until it is not skillfully practiced at the workplace. To practice at the workplace, it becomes very important, that is in every organization there is a particular culture. In every organization there is a particular system, procedure and the way of working, and trainer has to train those employees, those who are the trainees, in a way that if they find the situation is different in the given situation, then they have to be more creative and more adaptive, more flexible, and this type of the skills are also required. And therefore, when we talk about the training, then the training is very much important to make the success in the case of the ability of an individual. The another aspect which is called the aim. Aim is motivation. Unless and until we will not be having that particular motivation, it will be difficult, that is the how a person will perform at the workplace. To perform at the workplace, it becomes very important, that is the employee, those who are performing in an excellent way, in a star way, then they are supposed to be highly motivated. We will talk in this course about the motivation also, that is how to enhance the willingness or motivation, and before the enhancing the motivation level of the participant, a trainer himself has to be very highly motivated. So, therefore, to conduct a training program, this particular motivation is also very important. How we can develop that motivation, what type of motivation is there, what are the barriers in motivation, how we can overcome those motivational barriers, and that we will discuss. But what is required for a trainer to conduct a training program? An opportunity. O is for the opportunity. Unless and until one does not have that particular opportunity, he cannot deliver or develop that particular training program. So, it becomes very important, that is it is a combination for a success is A into M into O, ability into motivation into opportunity. The point which is to be noted is, that is here is the multiplication, it is not addition. So, any factor, if I make 0, the overall success will be 0. So, dear friends, it becomes very important, that is develop the ability, develop the motivation, and then getting the opportunity. That becomes very important to conduct a successful training program. Now, here I would like to take the first slide just by the quotation. What do you understand by reading this particular quotation? You will understand, that is, it is not, an employee is not only for doing a particular job, he can add the value. Value addition to the job can be done if his brain has been used, and not only the hands. When we talk about the only the hands, it means that limited job opportunities for the performance. If a person wants to develop a very high level of the performance ability, then in that case he has to be very much situational, that is he has, as in a given situation, should be allowed to work. And when we talk about the managerial functions, planning, organizing, delegating. So, when we talk about the use of brain at the workplace, it means that in addition to the decentralization, because when you do this decentralization, it means that only organization structures, that is only you are talking about the hands, but when we are supposed to talk about the brain of the employees, how to be more creative in a given situation, allow to do the work, creating that culture, and that is the important of the HRD, human resource development or training and development. That is, the employees are allowed to use their brain, and that is, if an employee uses his brain, it is for nothing. You are not, you have to pay any additional, right? It is already encompasses in his perks, but there are certain organizations when they find that is the employees are using their brain, then definitely they are giving more incentives as a part of the variable pay is there. This type of the HR culture that has to be developed. Many times it is developed during the orientation program, that is whenever there is a orientation program, then during the orientation program it has been mentioned. When I was in the Shriram group, I know that is in the beginning itself it was told that is it is very important for HR department to enhance the freedom at work, so that they can make the best use of their brain at the workplaces there. And that is why I have taken this particular concept, that is whenever we talk about the what assets do you have in an organization, and then the importance are, normally whenever we talk about the assets, we talk about the budget. But it is true that budget is to be there, but what is important is that is the employee should be self motivated, and that is only possible when they are having the interest. If they are having the interest in their workplace, when interest means motivated, motivation is there. If that motivation is there, interest is there, then definitely that arousing that interest at the workplace, making a feeling of a family at the organization, that type of interest is developed, then definitely the person will be not sleeping, but that he will be contributing. Next is the values. What type of the value systems are there? We know that is the personality, there are different types of personalities, and if the personalities they are having the value system to hard work, to contribute, to having the affection to the organization, belongingness to the organization. If this type of the values are there, there is a job involvement, employee engagement, job enrichment, all these type of the value systems are there in an organization, then that organization will be the best, great workplace, rather than just only a good workplace will be there. What is the role of the trainer? Trainer's role is, that is these skills, job skills, HR skills, already I have mentioned about the different types of the skills. Those skills, imbibing those values, organizational values, developing the interest, and then if this combination is there, then definitely the human resource that will convert into the human capital. So, what is required is, that is we should not sleep on these assets. These assets are provided, employees are provided, and every employee is given by this particular type of the skills, values, interest, and naturally by the budget is there. What a trainer does. So, we will now talk about the role of the trainer. The first is, we have to understand who are the stakeholders. Days have gone when we were talking about the external stakeholders only. We were talking about the customers, we were talking about the suppliers, but in addition to this, now we have to also take care of the internal customers, and internal customers are our internal employees are there. Trainer should educate, trainer should train to the employees to understand that is they are working in an overall society. Society is also a stakeholder, and every pin and point of the society, and they are the stakeholders. So, what is required? That is employee has to manage all these stakeholders, a trainer that he should make awareness about the stakeholders and should train about that is the how stakeholders are to be managed. Now the second picture, build teams to leverage diversity. Now we know that is these type of the meetings, whenever the organization is conducting the different types of meetings, then that require an experienced leader. A leader who is aware of the different strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, different types of the situations, IR situations, HR situations, then all this type of the interactions when he is already having, then he will be able to address the team's competency. Because enhancing the individual's competency is fine, but whenever we talk about the organization should know that is how to enhance the team competency. And we are aware that is many organizations or some of the departments in any one organization that they are not able to leverage the team efficiency. Team efficiency is much more. For example, whenever we talk about the forming of the team, how do we form the team? And whenever there is a team is formed, all or most of them are the competent persons, so there will be this storming. So after the forming, there has to be the storming session. But in the good organization, this storming that goes the minimum time. It does not take much time. So what is storming does? Storming creates the norming, norms are created, that is these different members, they learn from each other, that is the how they will work together, and then they will come out with the common solution, they will come out with the more efficiency is there. There will be the certain personalities, it has been mentioned here, that is the systems wizard. Systems wizard means somebody will say no, we cannot play with the system. If you are suggesting any solution, that the solution has to be within system, that is true. But when we talk about the definition of management, the definition of management is balancing the imbalances. What does it mean? It means that there within the system, even if you are having the short of resources, you are supposed to develop that particular type of the system where you can manage the imbalances. And the trainer, that he has to develop those managerial skills. As I mentioned, that is the planning, organizing, directing, leading and controlling. These are the functions of a manager. So an experienced leader here, he should be able to find out that is the if there is a system wizard employee, how to handle that particular employee. The another employee is that is the effective communicator. We should train a leader in such a way that is the how to develop that particular effective communicator in the organization. The trainer builds the team by identifying that is the effective communication practices. The third one is that is there will be the person who will be creative and genius. The creative and genius person may have the opinion different than whatever the traditional or conventional ways are there. And then in that case it becomes very important that is this creative and genius, this type of the people, they have to be handled differently, because they are the stars of the organizations, and many times they suggest a particular solution, a particular idea, and if that idea is very useful to the organization and that can make the sustainable and the growth of the organization, so that is the build a team to have a creative and genius people. Then there will be the devil minded analyst also. So therefore nowadays we will find in the era of the internet, that is we have lot of data, but when we have to convert this data into information, information into knowledge, knowledge into wisdom, and wisdom into truth, this is the pyramid. If we have to convert that particular pyramid, then you should be strong analyst. Especially for the management jobs nowadays, the two jobs are very very prominent. One is that is the analyst job, and other is consultant's job. They are highly demand. There is those who, whenever there is a data, how effectively they analyze that particular data. But analysis of data is just a part. What is important is, after analyzing the data, what is the discussion? What is the output of that particular analysis? How you connect that output with the current situation, and therefore, this type of the analysts are also required in a strong team. Then practical organizer. Thanks to the technology many times give the solutions which may not be the practical. So then what to do? So there are required to be the certain employees, those who will be able to make the practically organizing whatever the solutions which are coming out through the system wizards questions, or the effective communicator, experienced leader, creative genius, then defined mandate analyst, and all these hard traits are also required in the trainer to build the teams to leverage the diversity, and then practical approach also. What is right, what is wrong, what is applicable, what is not applicable, that he should be understood. And finally, the risk checker, because the training is provided for the future requirement, and whenever we talk about the future, there is a risk, and one should be risk checker. We have to also understand the differentiation between the risk and gambling. So here I am suggesting the risk and not the gambling, and therefore in that case one should be able to take the risk and then build the teams with these all type of the personality traits are there. Then role of a trainer is to manage the communication, which already I have mentioned, that is effective communicator, and then whatever he is communicating, that should be clear, easy, and one should be able to understand what type of program is given. Like here you will find a cartoon has been given, transfer skills. I am not sure, I want to know how to use the facts, and therefore in that case the many people, they may be provided the resources, but they may not be competent enough how to make the use of it, and then once you give them the training, they will become efficient. So the trainer, when we talk about the role of a trainer, the role of a trainer is to manage the stakeholders, build the teams to leverage the diversity, manage communication, and transfer the skills for the employees, for which purpose the training program has been provided. So what is primary goal of a training? The primary goal of a training is to help users move from confusion and no acceptance through the communication to ownership and high acceptance level. Like many times employees are not realizing the importance of training. What they understand is that is they are confused, they are not very clear. That is why I am getting this type of the training. What is the use of the training? And in that case, trainer should ensure that is this type of the training which has been provided to the, that is the importance, need and importance of training, that should be very clear in the beginning itself. For example, this particular type of the course which I am offering, this course is helpful for the trainers so that they will understand how to design, identify the training needs, how to design the training program, how to execute the training program, how to evaluate the training programs, and how to make the best training program at their workplace. And therefore in that case this is the through communication. However, through communication I would like to add one more terminology here, and that is the pedagogy. That is through pedagogy, that is a teaching methodologies. Different types of teaching methodologies which the further we will be discussing. That communication process has to be used. For example, it can be the case studies, this can be the business games, this can be the exercises, this can be the statistical data collection and analysis research method, and through this way we can make them clear their confusion and make them to ownership. The employee engagement is very important if there is ownership is there amongst the employees. If the employees are having this particular type of these engagement, that is commitment and that is ownership. Unless and until that feeling of ownership is not there amongst the employees, then employees will not be able to make the proper transfer of that particular skills. We have to develop that ownership. This organization is your family. You are the part of this family. You are the one amongst all of us. So therefore, this type of feeling is very, very important. And then when this type of the notion is there, that is, I am the member of this particular family, of this organization, which the trainer makes this miracle happens, and then in that case high acceptance level will be there. For high acceptance level, vigor is required. According to Schofoli, vigor is required, absorption is required, and dedication is required. Nowadays there is a lot of demand of the training programs to enhance the employee engagement. Trainer should be able to develop that particular type of the vigor, that particular type of the energy, that particular type of the commitment, that is the yes, I have to do. Now, however, there are different ways of working, work from home, work away from home, away from the workplace but at work. So, these type of concepts are already there, but ultimately commitment is required. If commitment is not there and employees at the workplace, there will not be a reasonable output. Employees away from the workplace but at work and there is no commitment, again there will be no output of the performance. So, what is required? Trainer has to develop the ownership, that commitment, that level of acceptance at the workplace, so that employee gives more than 100%, and then he gives voluntarily. It is not because of the fear of punishment or fear of losing the job, but this type of the acceptance, this type of the ownership, this type of the commitment that he never realizes that there is no feeling, I am working for others, I am working for myself, I am working for developing myself, I am working for the excellence of myself, and therefore, if this mindset is there, those organizations will be definitely a very, very successful organizations. Whatever I was talking about, that was not only for the good workplace, but that was for a great workplace. What a trainer does, a trainer, he is not only creating the good workplace, but he is creating such a workplace where the people want to work. I understand the practical aspect also, that even if, because I have 11 years of the industry experience, so I know that is how the people work in the industries. So, they may go for the betterment of this particular looking for the better opportunities, they may go, but they will not forget their past organizations. They will be in connect with their past organizations, because everybody has a freedom to go further for his progress, but the connectivity, the relationship with the past organization is the same. So, therefore, in that case, that if there is no connect, then that is not a great workplace. The great workplace is that as I mentioned about how it is the commitment, loyalty, how about the relationship, how about the after leaving the organization also people are connected, and those type of the places are called the great workplace. So, now we will talk about what is a great workplace. When people did trust, it is not the culture when they are out or from that particular place, that is they have a fear that what will happen when I am not there. Now, in that case, that even if they are not at the workplace, they are having the trust to have with their superior, colleagues and subordinates. They have pride in what you do. So, it is the question not that is whether you are in the top management or middle management or in the lower management cadre, but it is the feeling is there, that is whatever I am doing the best. I am doing in the great workplace, I am working in this organization. So whenever a person introduces himself and before saying his name he says I am working in this particular organization, that means that he is having the pride in for that particular organization, and therefore it becomes very, very important, that is the person connect, the industry connect, the emotions connect, that becomes very, very important whenever we talk about the pride in what you do. Now when we talk about, and that is the enjoy the people you work with. So it becomes very, very important, that is the workplace is a place of joy. I am enjoying that particular workplace, I am talking about that particular workplace, I am sharing my experiences with that particular workplace. I feel pride in saying that I am working in this workplace. I am also having the trust with the people, those who are working there. So you see, that is the happiness index of that particular employee is very, very high. And if this type of the workplace, and most of the employees when they say that this is the great workplace, I love to work here, and then in that case you will find that is the trainer's role is that is he creates that great workplace. How this great workplace is to be created and how the training can impart this type of the culture, that we will talk about into the next session. So thank you very much.